Well, I think everyone will probably begin, actually. First of all, thank you for joining us today. Welcome back if you've attended any of these before. If not, welcome. This is the Atlantic Circle InConversation series of online talks that we've been hosting sort of every week. We hope you enjoy. We've sort of had a sort of really good feedback from people that have joined the previous talks, that they've enjoyed it. So we hope to continue this for a little while. First of all, I'd like to say thank you and welcome to Dr. Tanya Murphy. She's a parent of one of our graduating alumni this year, or graduating student, sorry. She runs an education charity. It's based in Geneva, but she works with sort of NGOs, and she works with some of the students at the college as well, which is wonderful. I guess in terms of sort of the format of the talk, we'll probably it'll start with about a 20-minute talk, followed by a Q&A section. If anyone has any questions or sort of anything that they'd like raised in the talk, could you just pop it in the chat box, and we'll sort of address any of them towards the end of the talk, sort of with a Q&A section where we'll have a look at the questions and we'll sort of unmute anyone to ask them. I guess that's probably sort of everything. In terms of talk, it'll last about an hour, including the Q&A section. And yeah, as I said, we hope you enjoy. We're sort of really excited about sort of this series of talks and sort of Tanya's talk as well. But yeah, as I said, any questions that you'd like addressed or sort of that come up from the talk, please do pop them in the chat. And we'll respond to them after the talk. I'm going to hand over to Tanya now. Thank you, and we hope you enjoy.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for coming to discuss with me all things social impact related. Keith, could you hear me well and see my screen?
Yeah, it's clear. Thanks.
Brilliant, brilliant. So just a word about myself. My claim to fame today is that I'm an AC parent. As Keith said, from a graduating student, I am a social anthropologist by training and set up an education foundation. And I live in Geneva, where I support foundations, NGOs, social entrepreneurs, and provide training on social impact management. And I've had the great fortune to work with, as Keith said, a couple of, or three actually, UWC AC-related projects, which is Amala, formerly known as Sky School. And you have Polly, the co-founder, with us here today, which is wonderful. And Amala works with refugee youth, providing online secondary education in a kind of UWC style. And we have Robin Jenkins with us as well, who's the founder of Atlantic Pacific. Hi, Robin, it's great to have you here. And which is based at AC. And I've also had the good fortune to work with a few students via the Atlantic College directly. So today, why does it matter to define impact? I want to briefly talk about what we mean by social impact, move on to why it's important, I think, to define your own social impact and the projects that you might be involved in or interested in. Then we'll turn to how you can define it in a really sort of comprehensive way. And finally, incredibly briefly, we'll touch on measuring, but that really is a whole other topic. As I mentioned, we've got with us here Robin and Polly, so I'm going to try and use as much as possible examples from those two projects. I'm going to try and go quite rapidly, so we have plenty of time to discuss, particularly as we have so many of you here today with, I'm sure, a huge amount of relevant and interesting experience. So just put in the chat anything which isn't clear, and I'll respond to any immediate questions after the talk from the chat, and then we can open it up to a more general discussion. So what is impact? I think I'm going to start by saying what isn't impact. And impact is not the same as outputs, and it's a confusion which often happens. Take, for example, this large, respected, well-funded NGO based in the Netherlands called Aflatun. And on their website, this is just a picture of their website, it says, here's our impact from 2018. And as you will see, some pretty impressive figures. 8.6 million children, 101 countries, very low cost per child, low cost versus high impact is the term they used at 0.29 euros per child. But when you look at those figures, however impressive they may be, of course, it tells us nothing about the impact of this project on the children, let alone on society. Impact then is the benefit to society, the long-term benefit to society. And the way I like to think of impact is to think of it as your why, kind of the ultimate why. Once you finish asking all your questions, why am I doing this? Why does this matter? When you get to the end, that's your impact. That's your ultimate goal. So for Amala, for example, their goal is that refugees should be able to lead the life they want to lead and build their communities with their own agency and build the future that they want, whether that be back in their home country or in a new adopted country. And Atlantic Pacific, their impact goal is quite simply, to reduce global drowning, which I was quite shocked to hear is actually the third cause of death worldwide. So that's a really clear impact goal, which you can't really argue with. Why is it important to define your impact goal really clearly? I think it's important for three reasons. First, it allows you to have a brilliant, sustained focus and clarity of purpose. As I mentioned, you can focus on the why beyond the what and the how. Again, think back at that Aflatun example I just gave you. You can focus on why you're doing what you're doing, why it's important. And of course, that is far more engaging to people when they link with you because of why you're doing what you're doing rather than what or how. It allows you to be proactive rather than reactive, and focus on opportunities. The present time is, of course, a perfect example of that. With COVID, so many organizations and businesses around the world have had to rethink their operations. And when you have a clarity of purpose, it actually doesn't necessarily matter too much. And I think Amala and Atlantic Pacific are perfect examples of that. Amala, who had been running blended learning courses where the students would interact with online content together with a facilitator face-to-face, developed fully online courses, including art courses, to incredible success. So much so that they're thinking they may even continue this model for some of their students who are not able to access a classroom setting. And similarly, Atlantic Pacific has now developed an online program which is about to be launched, which is an online training program about to be launched, which is incredibly exciting development, which has happened partly in thanks to the constraints currently faced. So, 1, have a clear focus and clarity of purpose. 2, once you've defined your impact goal really clearly, you can measure it. And of course, being able to measure and communicate clearly the impact you're having in the world is absolutely essential to attract engagement, whether it's clients or staff or volunteers, and resources, which is of course funding or investment. And finally, defining your impact is important so that you can learn and maximize your impact, that you can draw the insights from the measurement I've just mentioned, integrate it into your operations and possibly strategy, and maximize your impact. So how do we go about defining our impact? And here, I think what's the key approach, and I think the most effective one, is to show how you get there. So, for example, if Robin tells somebody that his project is all about reducing global drowning, that's a powerful statement in itself. But isn't it even more powerful when he can show exactly how he's getting to that reduction? And similarly, with creating agency amongst refugees, how are you doing that exactly? Now, here is a little snapshot from Google. I just put in theory of change. And just before I explain a bit more what it is, just to show you how it looks like. A theory of change is your program in a nutshell, ideally in a little infographic. I look at this one just here, for example. You see activities, going to outputs, going to outcomes, going to impact, really clear. It's sort of half a page of A4. Your project is there. And it's amazingly impactful when you come to doing funding proposals. Polly, if I can quote you, I think you said after we worked on theory of change together, you did, if I understand correctly, that some of the immediate funding proposals you did were just that much easier to write up once you had this in such a clear fashion. So what is theory of change? It's otherwise known as also impact value chain, but they all have a similar core to it, which is to define your activities, how they lead to your outputs, which is your immediate results, how those immediate results then create change. That's where it becomes interesting. So you might do something, but perhaps it has no effect in the world. Your outcome is there to say, no, it really is doing something positive. Your outputs, you can control it. It's what you are doing directly as a project. When you come to the outcomes, it's a little bit less under your control because it implies that people are actually benefiting from what you're offering. You can take a horse to water kind of thing. Once you have your outcomes and you're able to show what are the changes, the effects, the benefits, the value you're trying to create amongst your beneficiaries, or indeed for environmental projects to the planet, then you can talk about the impact. What will those changes, what benefit will it give to society? Just very quickly, I'm going to give an example here. Just conscious of time here. For Atlantic Pacific, for example, one of their activities, amongst others, is to create a lifeboat in a box. That lifeboat then gets delivered to a disaster-prone area. There's a short-term result, if you want, but in itself, a lifeboat sitting somewhere doesn't do very much. The outcome is that it then enables communities to be empowered to respond to disaster. So it's sort of from that boat to the empowering the communities. And then, of course, in the event of disaster, it will hopefully enable lives to be saved. For the refugee youth in Amala, they might immediately get a high school diploma and get access to a holistic, empowering UWC style education. That's an immediate result, a short-term result, which in itself is a good thing. But the really interesting bit is, what will this short-term result actually bring to the refugee youth? What is the outcome of having a high school diploma and a holistic, empowering education? And that is, of course, that they can develop their own initiatives. They can then go on to do tertiary education, that they can have a higher confidence, and many other things which a quality education will give you. And in the longer term, they create the society that they want. So that, in a kind of very briefly, is a theory of change. Some people actually start from the problem, go from problem, activity, output, outcome, impact. Some people put in their inputs. It doesn't really matter. The key bit is to really show how you go from your activity to your result, to your benefit, and to the longer term societal benefit and value. Okay, so now you've defined your impact, you defined it, what it is, and how you're going to get there. The next important piece of the puzzle, if you want, is to think about how you're going to measure it, because that's where the real value comes in. There is a slight difficulty, I should say, in measuring impact, and one which people tend to gloss over when we talk about impact reports and impact investment, actually, you can't really measure impact. And the reason why you can't measure your impact, or at least most projects can't measure their impact, is for two reasons. One, as I mentioned, impact is a long-term thing. The true impact of Amala might only be seen in 5, 10, 20 years' time. Similarly, there may be no use for that boat sitting in a town in Japan or in Mozambique. Hopefully there'll be no use for that boat ever, actually, but it may only come into its own, in years or decades from now. And the second reason why impact is actually difficult to measure is the problem of attribution. How there are so many factors which go to societal change. How do you know the extent to which your specific project created that impact? So what we do with that, there is a workaround. And again, we come to the beauty of theory of change. If you haven't got one and you're involved in a project, please take the time to create one. It really is a magic tool, because once you have your theory of change, you can go ahead and you can measure your outputs, you can measure your outcomes. And then it becomes quite simple to say, well, we know that outcome A will lead to this impact. Very simple example. If you are concerned about, if your impact goal is to have a better, healthy population, and specifically a population with a smallest possible COVID rate, then you might have a project around hand washing. Now, you can quite easily measure how well your project is running and how many people are now washing their hands thanks to your project, or washing them better, shall we say. But you could never say that, looking at national statistics, what impact your project had in that. What you can say is, I know that when people wash their hands, they're going to have a less chance of catching COVID, because there are 101 medical studies which show the importance of hygiene to lower virus infections. So that's a very small example of why a theory of change, which shows very clearly how you go from activity, output, outcome to impact, allows you to make quite grandiose impact statements, even if you can't actually measure your impact, because you're going to measure your outcomes. And the other beauty of a theory of change is it allows you to treat impact in a truly multi-dimensional fashion. The Impact Management Project is a fantastic collaboration of the leaders in this field globally. And after 2 years of work, they decided that impact has 5 dimensions, and that has become basically industry accepted standard. And those dimensions are what, who, how much, contribution, and risk. The what is, what we spoke about, really, what outcome occurs, what change is actually happening. The who is quite interesting, is who's experiencing it. And that becomes quite important in projects where perhaps resources you're wanting to target, perhaps the more undeserved population. Obviously, something like an institution like Atlantic College or UWC as a whole would be a perfect example of that. Many private schools give probably maybe not quite as good, but still a very good holistic education to students, but it's giving it to people who can afford, £30,000-40,000 a year. UWC, one of its key points is going to people who wouldn't otherwise, who would get the quality without being able to afford it. So the who becomes really, really important when you talk about impact. Are you reaching those that need to be reached? How much? Again, crucial. In the case of Atlantic Pacific, how much is pretty extreme. It is literally life or death. In the case of Aflatun, with their 0.30 euros per child, I'm kind of guessing that the impact is relatively small, even if they're reaching 10 million children. Contribution, I mentioned before. To what extent does your project contribute to the larger whole? And I particularly like contribution because it enables us to see our project as part of an ecosystem, but it's also a really wonderful dimension of impact because it encourages collaboration. So if we take, for example, Amala, Amala is not the only NGO which is trying to help refugees, especially in camps, obtain a secondary education. There are many others. And when you think about contribution, it kind of encourages you to think about, well, actually, how can I collaborate with those other organizations that have the same impact goal as me so that we can maximize collectively our impact. The final one, risk, is often overlooked. And those of you who are interested in this, I will be giving links afterwards. Do look at the impact management project on risk, because it actually gives nine dimensions of risk that you can think about. So really, really interesting when you're at the project inception or trying to develop your project, to be sure that you're covering all those 9 aspects as best you can. Okay, so those are little caveats in terms of how to measure impact. But with those caveats aside, that you really are focusing on outcomes and that impact is multidimensional, how do you go about measuring your impact? Measuring impact is a process. It needs to be planned. Ideally, you plan it at the beginning of your intervention. Once you've planned how you're going to do it, you want to define your indicators. Indicators will enable you to measure what progress you've got at any time towards your outputs and outcome goals. So an indicator is it's a measure of progress, basically. You want to make sure that your indicators are smart, that they're specific, measurable, actionable, relevant, and time-bound. People always forget the last one. Time-bound is important. If you're talking about an increase in confidence, say, with Amala, is it increase in confidence in the last week? Is it in the course of the last 2 years? What is the period you're looking at? It's particularly frustrating when projects talk about an increase in revenue, but don't tell you what period they're looking at. Relevant is also very important. Is your indicator actually giving you information which helps you and the people you're communicating to assess the extent to which your output or outcome has progressed? Once you planned your process, you can go ahead and do your measuring and data collection. And this is something which hopefully is ongoing. If you've got a good plan, you're going to be collecting data on an ongoing basis, and your impact and your indicators will be populated on an ongoing basis. So to measure your indicators, you're going to collect data. You're going to go out and you're going to capture data from perhaps your operation dashboards. You're going to go out and collect data. If you need user feedback, you're going to analyze it. Once you have your data, your analysis, you're going to generate insights. You're going to see, what is all this data telling me? What have I learned about my impact, my outcome, and are my outcomes happening like I wanted them to happen? Are my outcome goals being met, and consequently my impact, or aren't they? What can I do to tweak my project, my operations, my strategy, so that I can maximize those outcomes and that impact? And finally, and crucially, you're going to communicate to your different audiences. Your funders are going to want to know, your investors will want to know, your colleagues are going to want to know, your partners are going to want to know, the general public is going to want to know. And for each of those audiences, you're probably going to have a slightly different story to tell, which is why I come back to the importance of planning. Do you want to have just facts and figures? Do you want to have some stories? Do you want to have some videos? Once you think about your audiences, you'll know the sorts of communication methods you're going to need. So to summarize, define your impact. Why? Because you want to have a focus. You want to clarify at all times your operations and strategy. You want to be able to measure your impact through strong outputs. You want to focus on value, on the value you're creating beyond the outputs that you're giving. You want to gain actionable insights, and these insights, once communicated well through a data-driven, rich communication strategy, you're going to generate resources. You'll get the funds, you'll get the investments, you'll get the clients, you'll get the partners. you'll get the beneficiaries as well, of course. Keith, you might want to copy and paste these resources into the chat, because they're all kind of clickable, these different links. Any of you want to go a little bit deeper, I started off with a course that I actually created for the International Trade Center. It'll take you anything between 1 and 4 hours to do that course. Once you've done it, you're going to have a great theory of change and a fantastic plan to measure your impact. I've also put here some templates you can use if you just don't want to go to the course and just want to have some templates to help you along. That's fine too. Impact management project I mentioned. The business call to action has an online free platform to create your theory of change. They call it the impact value chain, same thing. And that's really nice if you prefer to just work online from the start. They also have a fantastic indicator bank too, if you're struggling with finding the right indicators. A colleague, a friend of mine, Paulina, has created a bespoke communication strategy to go with my course that I mentioned above, a step-by-step guidance on how to plan your communication strategy. SOPACT have got these lovely snappy videos on YouTube. They take different elements of impact management in kind of 2-3 minute videos. They're pretty cool. And this is a little bit more engaged online course, more old fashioned, but very, very thorough course. Thank you. If you do want to contact me after today because you have more questions, please do. Keith, again, please just put these into the chat. They should be linked. I'm on LinkedIn and active there if you want to contact me through LinkedIn. Otherwise, my email address is here, or of course via Keith. I'm going to stop sharing now, and yeah, I look forward to answering any questions and hearing any thoughts, concerns, challenges that any of you might have.
Brilliant, thank you, Tanya. I guess in terms of sort of a lead-up question, would you be able to, I guess, share a bit more about your background directly and sort of previous experience, just I guess so that people have maybe a bit more of an idea?
Sure, Keith. I mean, as I mentioned, I live in Geneva and work with foundations such as at the moment just started work with Comic Relief, which is wonderful, with a big refugee cohort of theirs, and Accelerate 2030 is a social entrepreneur accelerator program based at the Impact Hub here in Geneva, and I'm supporting them as well with working out all questions to do with monitoring, evaluation, learning, and impact management.
Okay, brilliant. Let me just unmute Emma. I think she has a question. Hi, Emma, are you there? Hello, Emma.
Let me read her question.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, wait, how do you go about aligning activities that you are conducting, which perhaps on reflection do not fit in with the wider aims of the organization? Is Emma still with us? Yeah, is it just a mute?
Yes, she's still here.
Oh, okay, she's still here. Good. Emma, I love that question. How do you go about aligning activities that you're conducting, which perhaps don't fit in with the wider aims of the organization? I mean, I'd love to hear anybody else's take on this as well. Please do come in here. I would say 2 things to you on that, Emma. I would look carefully at your theory of change and see whether those activities fit in there somewhere. And if your activities really don't contribute to the outcome you're trying to have and your impact, I think I would suggest actually gently terminating them, because otherwise you risk just going kind of all over the place. I've seen organizations do that, and it doesn't really help them or anybody else. If, however, you find that it does, or maybe you find that you've shifted slightly, that's also fine. Then you just need to realign your outcomes, your outcome goal, and say, well, actually, I've thought about it. This seems to be more what's needed in this context. maybe I wasn't quite right in wanting to do this, to do A before, and now I want to do B. So then you want to shift it. But it's really important that whatever you do is aligned with your ultimate impact outcomes goals and impact goals. So modify those if you need to, if your activities are the right ones to have. I hope that helps.
Brilliant, thanks. I guess just in terms of questions, one thing I was thinking, with your experience of working with sort of NGOs, I guess both locally and internationally, how often are they using this sort of the theory of change in your experience? Is it something that's the norm, I would guess, or is it something that people should be more aware of?
I think it's increasingly coming so. I mean, theory of change has been around now for a few decades, and monitoring and evaluation and learning is nothing new. But I do think that it's coming much more important now. And as many of you who are involved in projects and getting funding, if it's in the NGO sector, you need to do a log frame. And log frame is basically a theory of change by a different name. So I think, Keith, it is, yes, very, very widespread. And even in social entrepreneurship world, you might call it a bit different, but the basic idea of going from there's a problem out there, and this is what I'm doing it, and this is what I'm doing, and this is how I'm doing it, and this is why I'm doing it. There's nothing original about that, really. Just many people kind of forget to do it to their detriment, I believe.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant.
And I'd love to hear from other people, in terms of how things are going for you. If there are any challenges in terms of theory of change or impact, would love to hear, or what's working well and not working so well for you.
Okay, brilliant. We have a question from Andrea. How would you go about measuring and showing the impact of UWC?
Okay, and Andrea is asking that as a director PPE team. That's the that's the philanthropy partnership.
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. A great question, Andrea. How do you go about measuring and showing the impact of UWC? Well, I think if you've been listening, Andrea, I think you've got the first answer there, which is to, one, define your impact, what you're trying to do. I think in your case, it's quite straightforward. You're wanting to create a more just and fair world where citizens of the world interact with each other well and have mutual respect. I think that's probably the ultimate UWC goal. And then you would work your theory of change. How exactly is the provision of UWC education, which is the activity, how are we getting to that impact? I would create your theory of change. I would make a beautiful infographic if you don't have one, because it's so nice to have it, beautifully presented like I showed you. And once you have that, I would think about, what your outputs are probably quite straightforward. I'm sure you already have measures of how many students you have, etc. But then you could look at the outcome level. What are the values you're trying to have in your students? I know you had one of that wasn't Harvard, it was Boston, wasn't it? One of the American universities.
I think we had the Harvard impact study.
Exactly. That did that. So looking at outcomes, at what are the changes that are happening for the students in the short term and in the medium term, and judging from previous studies, what do we think that will be the longer term impact? But of course, the WWC having been going on now for so many years, it shouldn't be hard to look at the impact after 5 years, after 10 years, after 20 years, after 30 years. But happy to chat more, Andrea, if this is something you want to go into more detail, if you're thinking about that.
Thank you. Next up, we have Jenny Moberg. Let me just unmute. Hi, Jenny, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hey, Jenny.
Hi, Tanya. So I would like to go back to the, you were talking about when it's difficult to sort of finding workarounds for when it's difficult to measure your impact. And my guess is that that's not an uncommon situation, that actually being able to measure your final impact is difficult. You gave the example of AP and actually finding how many lives are saved it may be quite difficult. So could you say something more about using proxy or indirect measures instead of final impact, and how that would work, and is it okay as long as you are sort of transparent about the fact that this is a proxy for your sort of ultimate impact?
100%, Jenny. I think you know, as I say, the way I see it is that you measure what you can measure, and then through your theory of change, or in this case, you know, I don't like to use jargon, but we can call it the narrative theory of change. Let's call it the description, if you want, of the theory of change. You show how your outcome goes to your impact, or in this case, you mentioned proxy indicator. As long as you can demonstrate that the indicator you are measuring leads to the indicator you actually would like to measure if you could, then you're covered. So one thing I didn't mention for the sake of brevity, but I think is important in your theory of change, you want to have these assumptions very clearly laid out. So in this case, Jenny, when you're describing, when you've got your assumptions of why you think your program is going to lead to where you want it to lead, you could mention at that point this particular proxy indicator. For those who don't know, proxy indicator is an indicator instead of something else. I mean, Jenny, maybe you want to give an example. My mind's gone blank here for a proxy indicator. Do you want to just quickly give one, Jenny, for those who might not know what it means?
Okay, now.
My mind's gone blank. Never mind. We'll come back to it.
I think I'm muted. Oh, no, I'm not muted anymore.
Yeah.
So I'll come. I mean, I guess with AP, a proxy indicator would be perhaps, well, maybe not, because it's more of an outcome. If you're looking at the number of people that have been trained by AP that go out into the field, you could perhaps look at how many actually go out on rescues as a proxy.
Yeah. Let's move on in interest of time, but I hope that responded to your question.
Thank you.
So
next
should we
up,
see?
Sorry, I think
should I read the question just so that we makes
go
sense?
for it.
Yeah. So another Tanya. Hi, Tanya. Can you elaborate on the tools used to evaluate impact? You mentioned questionnaires. What other tools are good to use? Great question, Tanya. I think just to answer very, very briefly on this, I think it's helpful to look at what you're trying to, the data you want to get. Once you have your indicators and you know what you're trying to get, you want to try and see what do you have already just through the normal running of your operations. So let's take, for example, let's think of an AMLA example here. Let's say that you're looking at okay, how much a student has learned, for example, on a course. Actually, here's a proxy indicator for you, Jenny. To really find out how much a student has learned, you'd want to have relatively elaborate before, and after test. It might be quite difficult to do. But if you just had the pass rate, and I know AMLA doesn't have a sort of a standard pass rate, but let's say pass rate in the AMLA terms, which isn't a conventional way of testing, but you can still say, yes, they've let's say there is a pass rate, and let's say, I'm qualifying that because I know it's not a traditional exam, but if you take the pass rate, you could say the pass rate is a proxy indicator for student learning, because they wouldn't have passed unless they'd learned something. Okay, so there's an example of using a proxy to get somewhere. So that's one thing, Tanya, is see what you've got already from your operations, and how many students have passed or not is a very easy figure to get just from your operational dashboard. And then you're right, what you haven't got, you'll need to go out and get that. And there are many, many ways to do it. I would recommend, Tanya, that you have a look at the concept of lean data, lean as in LEAN, lean data that Acumen Fund have developed. And they talk a lot about how to do questionnaires and how to do it in a kind of cost-efficient way using, things like SMS and other low resource methods of collecting user feedback from people. Polly, do you have any recommendations on who to involve in developing a theory of change? Yeah, that's really important, Polly. I think that in an ideal scenario, Polly, you kind of basically involve everybody, don't you? All your stakeholders. So, you start off with your core project team, but you also want to involve as much as you possibly can your partners and your beneficiaries, because if you say this is the change I want to see happening in the world, let's say in the case of Amala, if those refugee youth you're working with say, well, you know what, Polly, just don't really care about that very much. This is the change I want to see happening. Rather find that out earlier rather than later. We sort of come back a little bit to the first question we had. I think it was from I can't find your name right now, but the lady Emma. Who asked, Emma, yes, who asked about what happens if your activities aren't quite right. That's a good example. If you've done a theory of change, on the back of an envelope without speaking to the people you actually want to work with, and you go out and you realize this isn't working, my activities, I'm doing this instead, that's kind of a shame. Had you involved those people from the start, you would have defined better activities. So Polly, to answer your question, I think to make it inclusive, you want to have every single stakeholder as much as you can, time permitting, of course. Social impact and impact generally. Interesting. I think impact, you can have impact could be, for example, you can have a purely, let's think of an impact that isn't social. I don't know. I mean, just an impact, the impact of a dam. I'm not sure that's really social impact. The impact of a dam on I mean the environmental impact here of a dam. I think by social impact we're talking about, it's kind of a shorthand term in a way, I would say. Pelham, Alan, I think. Alan, I think it's a shorthand term for saying we're looking at positive change in society and the environment. Some people say social and environmental impact, but social kind of is a catch-all to all of them. And I think it just helps us when you're looking at projects to just bring the social impacts, to the fore. It can be opposed to financial. I don't want to do that because I don't think they are opposed, but it sometimes that dichotomy is made. I think it's a shorthand for saying let's really focus on the value we're trying to bring, and that's why we speak about social impact. But you're right. In theory, I think you could speak about impact just as well as social impact. As an organization, how do you adapt a theory of change or social impact when it feels like there isn't funding out there to sustain it? Again, interesting question. I'm not really sure if I can really answer that in any kind of simple way. But I think what I would say there, and I'm assuming you're speaking here from direct experience, I mean, you have two options. Either if you're convinced that the impact you want to have is the right one, then just carry on trying and knock on more doors and think about why aren't you getting that funding? Is it, maybe it's something else that's stopping you getting it, not because your theory of change, your impact goal is misplaced. If you feel quite strongly about it, then I would think about that. Like what are the factors stopping your funding? But if you really not getting any open doors, perhaps you did make a mistake, and perhaps what you're trying to do just isn't the right thing right now, in which case go back to the beginning and rework your theory of change and rework. Maybe you could say the impact is correct, that's right, but perhaps my way of getting there needs modification. Or perhaps you'll say my activities I know are the right ones to do, but the way I've expressed my impact is not quite ringing the right bell with funders out there. So it's kind of looking at your theory of change from beginning to end, so to speak, or from end to beginning, and working out where where there's a discord. And by the way, if anybody wants to unmute yourselves and pick something up, please do. Home Lingua. Potentially generous donors pay great attention to impact change data per person student reach. This was very apparent in UWC's successful application for education above all funding for schools in remote East Asia. It's a per person reached. Yes, I think you're right in many cases. I'm not sure, maybe you want to just put another comment in the chat, Home Lingua, just what your point is there, but maybe you're just making a statement, and absolutely, in some cases, the per person student is important, and I guess this speaks to what I was talking about, that dimension of impact, which is the contribution. So, to what extent is your project making a change to individuals? I think that's what's really, really, really important here.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
I can.
Oh, well, it's something that I've been discussing with various potential donors and past donors. And they are very tight. They have assessors who due diligence applications, and very often the ability to reach 1,000 more pupils in remote parts of the world affects very much the success of the grants. That was United World Schools, by the way, UWS, not United World Colleges.
Sorry.
But we put in an application to Education Above All originally for 1.8 million US, and it came through after about 3 years of going backwards and forwards for 2.2 million, and that was largely because we could demonstrate a multiplicity of targets in schools in 3 Asian countries.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Well, congratulations. That's really wonderful.
It's a very good charity, by the way, if you don't know about it.
I don't. I'm going to look into it. Mark had a few points. Do you want to just? I mean, since you've got several points there.
I've unmuted you, Mark.
Yes.
So, yeah, you
go ahead, Mark. You had a few comments there.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thank you, Tanya, also for your broad and interesting overview of this topic. So yeah, I just started saying that I'm part of a local food market, but it's a kind of a cooperative, you could say, in the way it works. The first question was like how to, just your experience, how to decide on which indicators you focus on when you have very limited resources, like some things are very time or resource intensive. Second, should I just list? It's just three.
Yeah, why don't you? I can answer together because in the interest of time, as we don't have much time left.
So the second thing I asked was your experience with nowadays the reception of social impact measurement, and maybe also is it different amongst different actors, so governments versus funds versus donors. And third one, I'm very curious to hear about how you navigate the tension between the inherent reductionism we have in impact measurement. If we look at, of course, we try to capture a rich reality and we have to reduce it. And also how do you recommend organizations to deal with the temptation to go more towards this quantification, which is also a bit sometimes playing along a game which we sometimes easily use. So for example, municipalities here sometimes like to use or point at social return on investment, which is also a monetizing of social impact, which I'm personally very critical of, because I think it's very hard to express these things. So that's what I would be very interested in.
Oh no, fascinating. And yeah, I think we should take this conversation, offline, Mark, because you've raised so many interesting topics, and I would really would love to hear your views on them. So just very briefly, at the beginning you spoke about oh yes, how to choose amongst indicators. I mean, you know, I'm sure you've come across the concept of KPIs, key performance indicators, and I find an easy way to work out, you know, what our KPIs are versus the rest of our indicators is to work backwards, so to speak. So think about your elevator pitch, you know, those 3 minutes you have with your potential investor. What are the kind of things you'll want to tell him or her about your cooperative? And the chances are the sort of 2 or 3 points we're going to highlight, working backwards, data towards those will be your KPIs. I hope that makes sense, Mark. Yeah. So think forward. What do you want to be able to communicate and to whom? And then think backwards. What are the top ones? I always recommend to never have more than 5 KPIs. Ideally, have 3. Not more than 5, the absolute outer limit 7 if plenty of them are quantitative. Which brings me on to your quantitative question. I think I'm not going to go into that question, your second question, because I think it's a bit too broad. But just to say that the second question about the reception of social impact, I think it's huge. Haven't got top of my head now the size of the impact investment market, but you probably have it. It's huge. But onto your third question, which is the kind of quantitative versus qualitative. Again, I mean, fascinating, and let's talk more offline on that. Just contact me. But I think that comes back to the point I mentioned about planning your impact management, because the quantitative versus qualitative debate sort of comes into who your audience is, who you're wanting to communicate your impact to. Now, the chances are an impact investor is going to want more on the quantitative side, whereas the general public, your Facebook audience, is probably going to want more on the qualitative side. However, both want both. So you want to make sure you're getting a good mix of quantitative data with the qualitative stories. And I think storytelling is having a huge resurgence as well, isn't it? So don't minimize the importance of having some stories. And in some ways, maybe I was a little bit disingenuous with that charity Aflatun that I criticized, you know, of having impact in these figures, because underneath all those figures, they do then have impact stories to their credit. There are stories of individual children who have used this training to go on and do wonderful things. So I think there is an example, Mark, where they've used figures, but then they've used stories. Well, I think they've missed out the in-between bit. And the other thing we can talk about again in more detail another time, perhaps, is how you can turn the qualitative data, you know, into quantitative. And there are quite easy ways that you can do that. Let's just quickly see what Felix had to say before we reach the hour. Felix, compelling. Oh, well, then you said exactly what I've just said. So thank you, Felix. Compelling stories can also go a long way to support statistics and facts. Absolutely, Felix, 100%. And they do go a long way. The only issue, of course, with stories is to be careful of is, you know, if you're affecting 8.6 million children and you have 5 wonderful stories, how do I know that those 5 stories aren't just outlying cases? And how do I know that a few more than 5 out of your 8.6 million children are also sharing these wonderful stories? So, you know, it's a bit of give and take there, and it's using your judgment as to how much of the facts and figures you use, how many stories. I mean, the best, as I say, is to have some figures, some fantastic stories, because it just gives a great picture, but then also have that middle bit where you're taking your stories and putting them into a quantifiable data, such as, for example, instances of, let's say, collaboration is important for your project, for example. So you could say instances of collaboration between, I'm just off my head, between boys and girls, let's say. That's important. If you don't have an actual number, you say instances of. And what you're saying by that is that I have collected 10 instances. Doesn't mean there weren't more, but there are at least 10. And let me give you a little bit of detail about it. So instances is nice, sort of halfway house between number and stories. I think we should, Keith, I'll let you finish off. I will stop here because I'm respectful of people's time. You should all have my contact detail. I just quickly put in my my email address here. Do feel free to carry on the conversation with me if you want. Oh, I've just put it to Polly rather than everyone. I'll just put it, while you close, I'll just put it in.
Okay. Well, we've shared in the chat the document that includes the resources that Tanya shared at the end of the presentation, as well as her contact details. But yes, do feel free to, as she said, pop through an email or get in touch if you have any sort of further questions or want to chat about anything. We will be sending out sort of a feedback form. We'd love to know what your thoughts were, if you have any interest in potentially being a speaker, or if you have anyone that you might recommend. Finally, we hope you enjoyed. We're really enjoying hosting these, and sort of the wide range of topics that we're getting to hear from, I think is amazing. But I just want to say thank you, Tanya. It was a great talk. It was a great sort of conversation. So thank you for your time. To everyone that came, thank you for joining us. We have another talk next Thursday as well, which we'll be sending out shortly. But we hope you continue to enjoy these. And yeah, if you have any questions or comments, do get in touch with us. My colleague Magda will be sharing the feedback form shortly. But we hope you enjoyed. This will be shared with everyone on our YouTube page. So if you want to go back to check anything, it'll be there. But if not, you can get in contact with Tanya directly. So thank you, everyone. We hope you enjoyed. Thank you.